We're often told how great it is to be principled and have a clear worldview underlying every decision, and indeed there are heuristics that need to be absorbed in order to operate effectively in the world and achieve our goals. However, not enough focus is put on the case where someone boils all of reality down to a single principle which they then try to maximise the application of. Ideologies like Nazism and communism tend to be criticised for reasons of extremism, the brutality they employ to achieve their goals, their exact programme, etc. Rarely is the criticism of these ideologies that they are too principled, or at the very least, too mono-principled. Nazism defines everything from the basis of racial struggle throughout history and only builds other aspects on top of that basis. Communism defines everything based on the historical class struggle and only builds other aspects on top of that basis. We can even see that something like anarcho-capitalism is similar in that it builds from the basis of the non-initiation of aggression and then goes from there to theorise. These ideologies have been historically attractive to the disaffected, or at least the first two have, because in a world of confusion and complexity they provide a comprehensive explanation of everything. Insanity only proceeds from there, because if you only have a singular principle and it is the basis for your entire worldview, then why wouldn't you try to actualise the principle to greater and greater degrees in the real world? Where are the brakes? There's only an accelerator here. In practice, this leads to a purity spiral that self-limits the ideology with either disastrous collapse or the emergence of a strongman who breaks through the principle and applies his own secondary principles as a brake. Left unchecked, the principle will swallow every field of life it can be plausibly applied to on a surface level. We've seen this in Nazi Germany, where the idea of Jewish physics may have cost them the war, or in Soviet Russia with the case of Lysenkoism, revolving around the idea of applying class theory to agricultural science. Today we see another monomaniacal ideology in the form of intersectionalism, sometimes called intersectional feminism, or simply social justice. This ideological framework measures everything on the basis of historically privileged dominance hierarchies. Everywhere around it is perceived an oppressive network of old boys working ceaselessly to keep marginalised people marginalised. No area of life escapes this lens. However, Nietzsche's infamous aphorism about fighting with monsters is instructive here, as too many have come to essentialise the SJW as the total explanatory cause for modern failings and the ultimate bogeyman, allowing other responsible parties to go unchecked. Even basic principles like equality can run amok. Equality means sameness with respect to a particular characteristic, but if we don't focus on the characteristics themselves and how we wish to manipulate them to achieve temporarily local goals, and we instead spiritualise equality into an abstract good, we lose its contextual value, and instead it becomes something all-encompassing that is good per se, period, full stop. Why wouldn't we then wish to see equality move from the legal realm to the boardroom to the bedroom, and on, never ceasing, always levelling everything in its path? Equality is good because it's equal, so more equality must be good. In this form, equality is sameness with respect to all characteristics. AI risk theorists talk of the paperclip maximizer, an artificial intelligence with poorly thought out goal structure, in which the command to produce as much of a product as possible is not checked by any countervailing programming, and as a consequence it consumes everything, turning the world into paperclips, or so the metaphor goes. It's also much like the parable of the genie teaching us to be careful what we wish for. A man who rubs the lamp and shouts, "I want all the money in the world," may find himself buried alive in currency. Political and philosophical principles behave the same way if they are not checked by other principles, and the reason is that all language is contextual and applied to a world in which the laws of physics may be constant, but the composition of the environment is constantly changing. The true danger of radical ideology isn't the willingness to use force or to propose abstractly extreme things, but this short-sighted impulse to use a single instrument to measure every factor of the world. Avoiding this failure spiral is difficult. Mealy-mouthed, wishy-washy, moderate centrism can't cut it. Instead, however extreme your means to achieve your goals, you must represent different factors with different principles and allow them to cross against each other and act as each other's brake. The limitations of reality mean that there will always be material trade-offs, and any system of thought that claims to represent the real world will involve trade-offs too. A concrete example from my own thought system would be that if we recognise that a free and open market excels both in productivity and avoiding winner-takes-all political combat over the levers of economic power, we cannot ignore the dialectical conflict generated by grievance movements that spring up to service the losers of market competition that hang on the edge of society. Communism was called up by capitalism. The total application of capitalism led eventually to exploding living standards, but not without offsets, not without losers. There must out of this come some kind of principle of subsistence that makes the most efficient trade-off possible against capitalism that can be made under the circumstances. Otherwise, if you do not have things like the welfare state and anti-monopoly law, then your system will fall prey to its own maximisation, and in turn communists will rise to destroy the legal apparatus of property and in their own way sow the seeds for their own doom, measuring everything as they do with the rule of class. Developed capitalist states were forced into this by their own success, even as weaker states which couldn't afford such things collapsed to communism. Recognising the welfare state, we cannot allow it to be maximised either. The weight of taxes would crush the economy, and so capitalism and the welfare state form a dialectical union of forces. However, there is some leakage. There is a yet further chink in the armour, and that is that productivity plus free shit means that a lot of people are going to want in on the game, and that would overload the whole thing, so we must maintain a sense of the nation and of border control in order to avoid incentivising conquest by migration. If you do not, then the ethno-nationalists will rise and in turn risk everything. You know, this all sounds very similar to something that's in the process of happening. This is how I come to a trialectical synthesis of competitive markets, a social safety net, and strong border control, a productive principle, a principle of loss limitation, and a principle of defence. This reflects the natural world where competing forces abound and must be addressed. Ideologies that choose to selectively ignore some of these forces will call forth their opposites and be locked into deadly combat. Now, you can argue with my specific principles, but that's just an example. What I want you to take away from this is the meta-level point. Avoid monomaniacal politics. If some group is addressing an issue, you should look into it too and see if you can address it better inside of your own value system and so undercut them. You should not create a single bogeyman for yourself, in this case simply because this is not reflective of reality. You have many enemies, and they are certainly not all in cahoots. The world is a great melee with alliances here and there. So I'll leave you with the slightly testing idea that your primary principle should be to have more than one primary principle.